My name is Savannah, and I am 28 years old. The first thing my older sister said when I reached for the serving spoon was, "Don't fill your plate. You didn't contribute a single dime to this evening." She said it loudly enough for every relative at the glass house to hear. A few forks stopped in midair. My mother, Cynthia, glanced at me, then smiled, as though the insult were harmless. "Real family comes first," she said. I nodded, placed the spoon down, and made a decision. The financial bleeding stops tonight. Have you ever felt like the invisible bank in your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the ambient hum of the glass house at Viridian Vineyards. It was an exclusive, glass-enclosed private dining atrium surrounded by lush botanical gardens dripping with an atmosphere of curated wealth. The evening was a masterpiece of luxury, carrying a final price tag of $19,850. I had secretly orchestrated and funded every single detail for my mother's 60th birthday. Yet, looking around the long, elegantly set table, you would assume my 32-year-old sister, Taylor, was the sole benefactor. She sat near the head of the table, basking in the relatives' praise, accepting compliments for the vintage floral centerpieces and the curated menu as if she had personally paid for them. I watched my parents carefully. My mother's complicit smile wasn't born of direct malice toward me. Neither was my father Richard's active avoidance as he suddenly found his wine glass utterly fascinating. It was a calculated transaction. Over the years, I had become the silent investor in their version of a happy family. Taylor's narcissistic outbursts and chronic demands were exhausting, and my parents had long ago decided that my dignity was the currency they would gladly spend to keep the peace. They allowed Taylor to humiliate me because it was vastly easier than confronting her reality. My silent suffering normalized her cruelty, maintaining the fragile, toxic equilibrium of our family hierarchy. They weren't smiling because they hated me. They were smiling because my public humiliation bought their immediate comfort. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a familiar sense of regret or sadness, but there was only cold clarity. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I didn't cry. I didn't demand an apology or cause a scene. I simply folded my linen napkin with precise, sharp creases and placed it beside my empty plate. I stood up, ignoring the confused stares of my aunts and cousins, and walked out of the glass-enclosed atrium. The hallway smelled of expensive oak and crushed grapes, but all I felt was the cool, crisp air of detachment. I approached the reception desk, where Logan, the venue director, was reviewing the final service notes. I didn't hesitate. I instructed him to pull up the original contract and split the bill. I handed him my premium credit card and authorized a payment of $5,500, completely settling the discounted base package I had originally promised my mother. Logan looked up, his professional demeanor faltering as I firmly stated that I would legally dispute any additional charges for upgrades I never authorized. I then offered him a simple solution to collect the massive outstanding balance. I asked him to take the final invoice for the premium editions and hand it directly to the person who actually ordered them, my sister. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I was liquidating a bad asset. I stepped back into the shadows of the vineyard's grand lobby, watching the dining room through the floor-to-ceiling glass partitions. The warm, golden lighting of the atrium made the scene look like a Renaissance painting, but I was busy mentally auditing the invisible labor that had brought them all here. For months, I had leveraged my corporate connections as a lead user experience designer to secure this highly exclusive venue. They had been booked solid for 2 years, but I cashed in substantial professional favors to secure the room for my mother. I had personally wired the $5,000 deposit to lock in the date. The initial package was supposed to be a reasonable $15,000, a generous gift I had been more than happy to provide. But then Taylor discovered the email threads. She had contacted the venue coordinators entirely behind my back, inserting herself as the primary point of contact. Assuming the invisible bank, me, would simply cover whatever she desired, she began unilaterally inflating the invoice. I watched through the glass as the waiters cleared the appetizer plates and brought out the massive, towering seafood platters Taylor had requested. I remembered the exact email she sent demanding premium reserve wines instead of the standard pairings, effectively adding thousands of dollars to the final tab. She had treated my bank account like an endless line of credit, spending my money to purchase the illusion of her own supreme generosity. My family had gladly consumed it all, praising her impeccable taste while she sneered at me for daring to reach for a serving spoon. The sheer scale of the financial and emotional exploitation settled over me, replacing any lingering familial guilt with righteous, undeniable fury. This was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a systematic, premeditated extraction of my resources. I had paid their property taxes when they were dangerously behind. I had covered emergency medical bills without a second thought. I had been the reliable, invisible pillar holding up the entire structural integrity of their comfortable lives. Now I realized their love had never been unconditional. It had been a subscription service, with me perpetually footing the bill. I stood in the quiet lobby, feeling the cool draft from the heavy vineyard doors, and audited my past. Every holiday where I was physically pushed to the side, every achievement of mine that was glossed over so Taylor could remain the center of attention. They had willingly consumed my money, my time, and my sanity, all while treating me like an uninvited guest at a dinner I was actively funding. The balance sheet was hopelessly in the red. It was time to permanently close the account. I watched the venue director, Logan, pick up the black leather folio containing the final, itemized bill. He adjusted his jacket, his face a mask of clinical professionalism, and began walking toward the glass atrium. The audit was complete. It was time for the collection. Through the glass partition, the scene played out with silent, cinematic precision. I watched Logan approach the head of the long table. He leaned down and placed the heavy black leather folio directly beside Taylor's plate. I couldn't hear the exact words he spoke, but I knew the precise script I had provided him. The woman in the red dress canceled the reservation payment and asked me to deliver the bill to you. The color vanished from Taylor's face in a spectacular instant, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. The ambient laughter at the table died immediately. I watched my mother lean forward, her brow furrowed in deep confusion, while my father stared at the leather folder as if it contained a live explosive. Instead of displaying a single shred of remorse or humility, Taylor's shock rapidly mutated into indignant, toxic fury. She slammed her manicured hands on the table, her mouth moving in rapid, angry syllables. A moment later, the heavy atrium doors swung open violently. Cynthia and Richard rushed into the lobby, spotting me standing calmly near the coat check. They didn't approach me with concern or apologies. They approached me to manage the crisis. "What do you think you are doing?" my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained panic. "You are completely ruining the family's night. Go back in there and fix this." My father stepped up beside her, his face tight with supreme irritation. "Savannah, you are overreacting to a simple joke," he demanded, his tone attempting to shrink my firm boundary into a childish tantrum. "Give them your credit card and settle this immediately. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire family." They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were entirely shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. They were gaslighting me, trying to convince me that withdrawing my financial support was an act of unforgivable cruelty, while public humiliation was just casual, acceptable family banter. Before I could even issue a response, the atrium doors burst open once again. Taylor stormed into the lobby, furiously waving the $9,350 invoice for her upgrades in the air. "Are you absolutely insane?" she shrieked, entirely unrepentant. "You cannot just abandon the bill like this. I am not paying for this." She felt fundamentally entitled to my money. She didn't view me as a sister. She viewed me as a financial asset she inherently owned. "You didn't contribute a single dime, remember?" I said, keeping my voice dangerously flat and completely devoid of panic. "You ordered the reserve wine. You ordered the massive seafood towers. You publicly claimed the prestigious role of host. I am simply letting you pay the price of admission." Taylor's eyes narrowed with pure venom. "You are going to march back to that reception desk and swipe your card right now," she threatened, aggressively pointing a finger at my chest. "You always ruin everything." The sheer audacity of her demand solidified my icy resolve. She had Absolutely no remorse. My parents had no remorse. They only had desperate panic because the funding had been abruptly cut off. I looked at the three of them, my mother, my father, and my sister, and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional screaming match in the grand lobby was abruptly severed by the heavy, rhythmic sound of a wooden cane striking the marble floor. Grandfather Edward, who was 82 years old and had sat in stony, silent observation all evening, stepped out of the dining room. Behind him, a massive crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins spilled into the lobby, drawn like magnets by the escalating shouting. Edward bypassed my enabling parents entirely and ignored Taylor's frantic, theatrical gesturing. He turned directly to Logan, the venue director, who had been standing discreetly by the reception desk observing the fallout. "Young man," my grandfather commanded, his voice carrying decades of sharp, uncompromising professional authority. "Bring your tablet over here and read the venue contract aloud. Every single line." Logan stepped forward, clinical and intensely efficient. He tapped his screen and began to recite the documented, undeniable facts. He confirmed that the initial $5,000 deposit, the intricate structural planning, and the sole financial authorization were all strictly and legally under my name. He then scrolled seamlessly to a secondary file. In a clear, unwavering tone, Logan read out a long series of emails from Taylor. He detailed how her numerous requests for premium upgrades had been initially flagged for lack of authorization. He then read the specific email where Taylor intentionally bypassed the venue's financial restrictions by putting her own credit card on file for the overages, falsely guaranteeing the staff that she would personally handle the inflated balance. The murmurs among the relatives grew into a collective, audible gasp. I watched the psychological architecture of the entire room shift violently. This was no longer a messy, emotional family dispute. It was a professional, documented dismantling of Taylor's elaborate lies. The illusion of the empty wallet was suddenly exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. For years, Taylor had operated under the supreme delusion that her authority and identity as the generous golden child were intrinsic to her personality. But in absolute truth, her entire persona was a rented facade, financed entirely by my quiet, invisible sacrifices. Once my funding was systematically removed, her power didn't just faded instantly and spectacularly evaporated. She was stripped bare, revealing that she had no actual capital, no intrinsic value, and zero respect left among the people staring at her. Her authority had been nothing more than a parasite feeding directly on my competence. Without my money to artificially prop up her generous host routine, she was just an angry, fraudulent woman holding a massive bill she desperately couldn't afford. My grandfather looked at her with cold, unyielding disgust. "You hijacked this entire evening," he stated, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You spent Savannah's money to buy yourself relentless praise, and then you had the sheer arrogance to tell her she couldn't eat the food she actively purchased." Taylor tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, desperately attempting to piece her shattered image back together. But the legal documents had spoken. The family drama had been elevated to an undeniable, transactional truth. The golden child was entirely bankrupt. But Grandfather Edward was not finished executing his judgment. He turned to the crowd of stunned relatives. "Tell me exactly how much Taylor charged each of you for your seats tonight," he demanded. Confusion rippled through the group before my Aunt Patricia spoke up, confidently stating the exact amount she had wired. One by one, the relatives began calling out their specific contributions. $500 here, $300 there. Within 60 seconds, the math was mathematically irrefutable. Taylor had actively collected over $4,500 in mandatory contributions from the extended family to allegedly cover their shares of the luxurious dinner. The lobby grew deadly, suffocatingly silent. I stepped forward, delivering the final, clinical blow to her crumbling empire. "When I secured the glass house, I utilized my corporate firm's partnership," I explained, my voice echoing like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "I negotiated a strict 30% discount on the entire $15,000 base package. But Taylor didn't charge you based on the discounted rate." The horrific realization hit the crowd simultaneously. Taylor had calculated everyone's share based on the undiscounted, highly inflated price. She hadn't just stolen the social credit for the evening. She had committed calculated, premeditated financial fraud against her own blood relatives. She had aggressively pocketed thousands of dollars in surplus cash to secretly fund her upcoming luxury vacation to Tulum. The disgust radiating from the aunts and cousins was palpable and heavy. They turned on her instantly, their faces twisting with deep outrage. She wasn't just ungrateful, she was a calculated thief. Stripped of all credibility and facing a solid wall of hostile relatives fiercely demanding their money back, Taylor was entirely trapped. Logan, ever the consummate professional, stepped forward with the wireless credit card terminal in his hand. The outstanding balance for the premium editions is $9,350, ma'am, he stated flatly. Panicking, Taylor shoved her hand into her designer purse and pulled out a heavy platinum card. She slapped it onto the terminal with a wildly trembling hand. We all waited in the heavy, judgmental silence. The machine let out a sharp, decisive beep. Declined. Taylor's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. She frantically dug out a second card, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it on the marble floor before swiping it. Another sharp, unforgiving beep. Declined. She was completely reduced to a hyperventilating, helpless mess. The power flip was absolute and permanent. The arrogant sister who had tapped a spoon and told me not to eat my own food was now practically begging. She looked at my parents, who were staring at the floor in profound, humiliating embarrassment, entirely unable to cover a nearly $10,000 tab. Then she looked at me, tears of genuine, absolute terror streaming down her face. "Savannah, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking pathetically. "Please, I'll go bankrupt. You have to fix this." I looked at her, feeling only the cold, analytic precision of a completed transaction. "Ownership comes with a price," I said. I turned my back on her and walked out into the cool, dark vineyard night. The fallout was swift, methodical, and completely merciless. Without my financial intervention, Taylor was forced to borrow the staggering $9,350 balance directly from my father, Richard. The bailout came with a legally documented, ironclad repayment plan that essentially seized her personal finances for the foreseeable future. She permanently lost her comfortable throne as the family organizer. No relative would ever trust her with a single dollar again. Grandfather Edward, thoroughly disgusted by the enabling environment that had allowed this massive fraud to fester, issued a strict mandate. He forced Cynthia and Richard into intensive family counseling, explicitly threatening to write them out of his own estate if they continued to bury their heads in the sand. I didn't stay around to watch the debris settle. I drove back to my apartment, walked through my front door, and systematically blocked all of their phone numbers. For the very first time in my life, the crushing, invisible weight in my chest was gone. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute lightness. I had spent years desperately believing that if I just gave enough, endured enough, and explained myself calmly enough, my family would eventually see my inherent value. But the deep truth of letting go of bloodlines is a harsh, necessary awakening. Cutting off a toxic family member is not an act of cruelty or petty revenge. It is an act of fundamental, psychological self-rescue. I realized that walking out of that glass atrium wasn't a tactical strike designed to destroy my sister's life. It was simply the moment I stopped offering my sanity as collateral for her illusions. We are culturally conditioned to believe that shared DNA requires endless, exhausting forgiveness, that family harmony must be preserved even at the cost of our own psychological survival. But true freedom is found only when you stop funding the comfort of those who actively mistreat you. I no longer feel the pressing need to explain my boundaries to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding them. Forgiveness isn't always meant for the other person. Sometimes it's the only logical way to set yourself free. True peace requires walking away from the table when basic respect is no longer on the menu. I've come to realize that the space left behind by toxic people is quickly and beautifully filled with clarity and self-worth. So, tell me honestly, if your family treated you as a human ATM, weaponized your generosity, and humiliated you publicly, would you ever sit at their table again? Let me know in the comments below. If you found value in this story, share it with someone who might need the courage to finally walk away. The real victory isn't their regret, it's your freedom.